Hi everyone, my name's Matt Thompson. I'm one of the filmmakers at York Place Studios. I'd just like to thank Fujifilm and the photography show and video show for having me along to be a part of this amazing event. Now, I'm a documentary style wedding filmmaker, meaning that I don't pose anything on a wedding day, I don't really take control of the scene or really ask anything of anyone except maybe to put a microphone on for the speeches and the ceremony. But other than that, I let the action unfold in front of me and I'll just try and capture it as creatively as I can and kind of embrace the spontaneity of the day. But I haven't always shot this way. You know, when I first started out, I didn't really have a style as such. Now I'm someone who massively loves gadgets and, I used to come to the photography show every year and always check out the latest gear. I love all of that stuff. But what I did when I sort of first started out was I bought all of the equipment I could see that I thought might help to make a more cinematic film. I had all of the kind of motorized glide tracks, all of these kind of tools which I thought were going to add production value. And I basically thought about weddings in terms of just big moments, things like the ceremony, the speeches, the first dance, cutting of the cake. All I was trying to do was capture these big moments in as cinematic a way as I possibly could. And, I started off doing that for my first year or two, and the results weren't too bad, I certainly was adding kind of production value with all of these tools that I had that the bride and groom had never seen before. And, I was kind of creating quite pretty films. There was nothing wrong with them, it was a perfectly good style, but I wasn't that happy in myself. I didn't feel like I fully connected with these films and I didn't really understand why at first. And it was only really on my own wedding day that I started to realise why that was. Because on my own wedding day, I was going through different parts of the day and I automatically started thinking about how I would be filming it. And what I realised was that during these moments when I was actually spending always a lot of time kind of setting up equipment and trying to find these kind of cinematic moments and interesting ways of capturing them, there was actually 1,000 other stories taking place all the time, little moments that were really interesting moments between all my friends and family that actually were just as important as anything else. And that made me kind of reassess completely the way that I actually thought about weddings. I decided that I needed to refocus my attention on what it was that I actually really loved about weddings. And that's something that no matter what style of filmmaking you're doing, I think is really important to do, to really think about what made you be interested in this style in the first place. So when I started to think about my own wedding day, I thought about actually the thing that I loved the most really was not just the kind of love story at the middle of it, obviously that's important, but actually I really enjoyed having all of my friends and family together, all in the same place at the same time. That's never really happened at any other time in my life. And I loved seeing the personality of them, all the little interactions between the guests, all of these little funny moments, Actually, 90% of our wedding really was about having fun. That's what we'd actually put all of our attention into. It was trying to make sure that everyone had a really, really great time on the wedding day. And I wanted to embrace that. I wanted to kind of capture something that showed the atmosphere of the day. So I had to think about a way of doing that. And what I eventually arrived at was that really what I wanted to capture was kind of the guest's perspective of a wedding day. And once I arrived at that idea of the guest perspective and thinking about how a guest sees a wedding, it really changed pretty much everything about the way that I was approaching filming. Because, first of all, what's important to a guest? Well, firstly, a guest isn't going to start directing all the action, they're going to just kind of be part of it, go with the flow. So I had to stop doing any of the posing. But secondly, every part of a wedding is going to be important to a wedding guest. They're not just bothered about the ceremony. They're going to have a great time and create great memories, on the dance floor or even just sitting at the table having fun with each other. All of these things are going to be equally valuable memories. And if they're important to the guests, they're going to be important to the bride and groom because they don't get to see a lot of this stuff. Also, atmosphere became important. Before I was a filmmaker, I was actually a lighting designer. I did that in theatre, and whilst part of my job was to make things look very beautiful, certainly in filmmaking, lighting can really enhance the cinematography. It's, cinematographer's best friend, in fact, it's the first thing that they'd go to. But when you actually light something up, you don't just make it look pretty, you actually set a mood. That was really what my job as a lighting designer was. It was to create the mood of a scene on stage. And so I realised that by lighting up scenes, I was changing the mood, I was changing the atmosphere. It was no longer how it felt to be there, it was just kind of my interpretation. And really, I wanted people to look at this film and be taken back to that moment. Light's inherently linked with memory, so I needed to really embrace the lighting conditions as they were and not alter that in any way. Also, intimacy became a big deal because, you know, if I was going to capture this from a kind of guest perspective, then it needed to be a guest who was part of the action. They needed to be involved, needed to be right at the centre of it all. So, you know, I stopped using a lot of zoom lenses and things and actually tried to get right into the middle. Now, I'm not going to be someone who is, you know, going to be a big personality of the wedding. It's going to be kind of a silent guest, but it needs to be someone who feels, you know, very involved. It can't be someone who's kind of on the outside of the dance floor looking in. It needs to be right at the centre of all the action. It also massively affected the way that I approached individual shots because I needed to suddenly give kind of a human element to all of the shots I was taking, you know? So whereas before I was doing a lot of kind of glide track shots or smooth pans or, you know, even, I mean, drones weren't particularly available at the time that I started, but I would have been all over drones because, you know, again, I love the gadgets. But what I actually needed to do to kind of create this guest perspective was to very much ground it in reality, ground it in human movement. So I actually adjusted my way of shooting and decided that actually it was going to be better to adopt kind of a fixed angle most of the time and basically have the action unfold within the frame and try and find an interesting way of doing that rather than make the camera create the movement for me. It also meant things like slow motion didn't really work so much for me because actually we don't see the world in slow motion. You know, we see it in reality. The only time when I could really use slow motion was for those kind of odd moments in life where it feels like something's unfolding in slow motion, which were kind of few and far between. I've probably only used, you know, 4 or 5 slow motion shots in the last 5 years. So it's not something I'm going to use all the time. And, you know, whilst I say it's going to be a guest perspective, we're going to play with that a little bit. You know, sometimes it can be a child, sometimes it can be an adult, but it always needs to feel grounded in human movements. So I also decided that the best thing for me to do was also to try and shoot a bit more handheld because a little tiny bit of movement feels kind of human to me. The most important thing really was that I needed to immerse myself in each individual wedding. You know, before I was going through with a kind of a shot list, you know, I knew what I needed to get at every part of a day. As I say, I was just trying to use these cinematic tools to capture it. But I wanted to really immerse myself in the wedding in front of me and try and capture the essence of this day. And that kind of changed everything about the way that I was approaching shooting weddings. You know, it even changed the equipment that I was going to use. I decided that actually I needed to shed all of these gadgets and try and get it back down as much as possible to me and the camera. And I actually went through a number of different camera systems whilst I was trying to, you know, establish what was going to work best for me, until I eventually arrived at Fujifilm cameras. And there's a lot of reasons why I particularly enjoyed using this camera for this style of filming. You know, firstly, it's the size and how discreet the camera is was a huge bonus in terms of being able to get closer to people. Having those analog dials means that when I'm moving on the fly, you know, I need to be able to react to scenes very quickly. So actually I can set up my camera whilst I'm moving rather than have to, you know, put it to my eye and start messing with the settings and be hidden behind there. You know, the colour of Fujifilm cameras is amazing. You know, it's something that I can actually capture it in camera and not have to worry so much about the colour processing afterwards, which is, again, great for capturing that atmosphere. And of course now with the X-T4, we have the inbuilt image stabilization, which means that I'm going to be able to, you know, do all of those handheld shots much more easily and get a more steady result while still, you know, we can still have that little sense of movement that we talked about, but it's going to be a lot easier to get that without having to worry too much about camera shake. So there's all kinds of reasons why this camera worked for me, but of course it's all just about finding the individual tools that actually remove your creative barriers. And that's going to be different for everyone. And of course that's true of your lens choices as well. It's all about, you know, finding a system that works for your individual viewpoint as a filmmaker. For example, it's mostly because of, you know, the sense of intimacy that I mentioned earlier that I don't generally use zoom lenses. I do have one, which is the 55-200, and it's a really useful lens to have in the bag. But whilst a lot of people might use that massive zoom capability to capture all of these, you know, candid shots throughout the day, for me the 55-200 is only really used if I'm kind of stuck at the back of a church or in a situation where it's completely impossible for me to get closer. Generally speaking, I much prefer to use a fixed prime lens for documentary moments because of that sense of intimacy, you know? I don't want there to be any kind of separation between the camera and the people in front of me. And so using a fixed prime lens actually makes me physically have to get amongst the action, you know, be a part of it, move my own feet. Of course, that also means that we actually have to think about the physical size of the lens because, you know, if we want to get close to people, for them to really relax around us, then it's much easier if the camera doesn't feel intrusive in any way. So, you know, that becomes another factor we have to consider as well. So as I say, I tend to go for fixed primes, and there are 4 lenses really that I tend to switch between on a wedding day, basically just depending on the level of context that I want to give to any given scene. As I say, I'm not really using them to cover distance as such, because whichever lens I'm using, I'm always going to be trying to get close to the action. So one of the lenses that usually is attached to one of the 2 cameras that I carry on my belt is the 56 1.2, which is what I'd very much call a moment or particularly character-led lens. It's the lens I'd use when the context of the scene is pretty much irrelevant and I just want to focus the viewer's attention on a very, very specific detail. But if I want to broaden that out a little more and include a little sense of context, reveal maybe a bit more of the setting, or even just kind of widen things out so I can frame the subject a bit more, I'll use the 35 1.4, which is kind of a perfect midpoint if we're trying to keep the viewer focused in on this one particular story. So it is moment-led, but it's not kind of a pure moment or, you know, individual character lens. One of the things that I really like to do a lot though is something that we're going to come on to in a second. I actually like to play around with including plenty of context to a scene and often have a few kind of separate stories or elements coming together in one frame. So to do that, we need a more context-driven lens, which for me is usually the 23 f2. Now there is actually a 1.4 version of this lens, which has a really beautiful look. But again, for me, the physical size of the lens and the weight as well, it being so tiny makes it the best fit for my particular style of intimate handheld shooting. So that's the other lens that's usually on one of my cameras during a wedding most of the time. And then when there's either just too many bonkers things going on, it's all about context, or maybe a situation where I'm thinking the subject themselves is going to get super close to me, which does tend to happen on dance floors where things are a bit unpredictable. I'll grab the 18mm f2, which is really just a pure context lens. There's usually no one individual story to follow. I'm just inviting the viewer to experience the full madness of the situation. So basically I decided that these lenses and pretty much just the camera were going to be my creative tools, and that I was going to leave all of my much beloved gadgets at home, which pained me, and just concentrate on trying to create something a little bit more raw and do as much as I could in camera. Because if I was going to really be a part of the wedding and kind of feel the atmosphere, my priority equipment-wise had to switch from what could perceivably create the kind of biggest cinematic shot to what was going to be quick to set up, discreet, and let me just be immersed in each couple's wedding. But it wasn't just the equipment that changed, it was actually the type of shot that I started to try and capture. One of the things that I realised quite quickly was that if I wasn't going to have the camera kind of creating the movement for me, I was going to have to find more interesting ways of framing images. So one of the things that I quite quickly started to do was to start using a higher depth of field and try and put multiple stories together, so that we can add a little bit more extra interest into the frame by seeing all the people kind of interacting or telling their own little individual stories. I also started to try and find an additional source of movement in the frame because we still want to actually capture that movement even if we're not doing it with the camera. So here we have, I think it's actually the granddad on the right here, so someone who's quite important to capture, but he's not really doing that much. But by using him in kind of the frame of the image and then focusing on the little girl in the background who's putting off some crazy dance moves, we can actually add a lot more interest to the frame and have that sense of movement while still capturing important people that we need to feature in this film. I also started to really embrace that fun side of the wedding and start to look for a different kind of moment that I wouldn't necessarily have focused on before, and actually try and find ways to anticipate these moments rather than just react to them. So, in this particular scene, I know that this little kid's going to fall over at some point because there's an adult on the other side of the rope. So I try and just position my camera and kind of play around with this and make it kind of a nice fun image that, it's part of the day. It's something that the bride and groom are going to enjoy. Or even just these moments here where, these guys are kind of interesting to look at, but by just playing with the motion of this balloon here, we're adding in, again, that little sense of motion that would be missing otherwise. And it's just kind of a little bit more fun, a little bit more playful. I also found that I started trying to not focus so much on the obvious part of the scene. For example, with this particular shot here, one of the first things that I normally do when I arrive at the reception is try and get a shot of the venue, but the venue didn't look that interesting. People are arriving, getting off the bus. Again, I could shoot that, but it's not that interesting on its own. And at some point, I know that the bride and groom are going to be arriving. We've also got these people here. So actually, by putting all of those things together in the frame, we create, hopefully, a much more interesting image. And even on the dance floor, bride and groom here, they're dancing away, and we probably would get a shot of them individually as well. but let's show them interacting with their guests, show them having fun and being a part of the wedding, not just this kind of separate element that we, solely focus on as I was doing previously. But also I started to, create my own kind of shots and just find moments that kind of amuse me in some way. This is just a kind of playful little scene where we're going to do a kind of hide and reveal, something that maybe you weren't expecting to see, and that just adds a little bit of fun into the film. Or, moments like this where it's just a little observation. I like the fact that it's a love sign in the background and these people are just completely ignoring themselves. It makes me chuckle, and hopefully if it makes me laugh, then it's going to make the bride and groom laugh and anyone else who's watching the film laugh a little bit. But as with any film, it's never just about the visuals. We've also always got to remember the sound side of things. And, it's important to remember that your camera is an audio device as well as a visual device. It's always recording. And capturing the right soundscape can really bring people into your film. And, I like to be a little bit nosy on a wedding day. I'm always listening out, just in the same way that I'd be looking for interesting visuals that can connect to each other. I'm also always looking for interesting audio clips that can connect. And sometimes I'm just using my camera pretty much as an audio device just to record these moments.
A phone call or two helps to get you through a long day's work and always brings a smile to your face. In their presence, there's no need for continuous conversation, but you find you're quite content in just having them nearby. Things that never interested you before become fascinating because they are important to this person who is so special to you.
We've got to remember that we are the eyes and ears of the couple on a wedding day. And, by putting those two bits of audio together, something that they wouldn't have heard, we can actually show them a little bit more of their wedding day that they maybe wouldn't expect to see. Of course, it's not just about the actual sound that you're recording on the day, it's also going to be about your music choices. It's very easy to go into a wedding film with kind of a set idea of what that music should be. But for me, it's actually, the music is going to set so much of the atmosphere, it's really going to change the way we feel about it. We've got to make sure that we're choosing a piece that fits this individual wedding. And so on a wedding day, I'm always listening out for music that's played. I can't necessarily actually use those particular tracks due to licensing rules, but I can get a flavour of what sort of music fits this particular wedding and that the couple might particularly like. And by using, that kind of style of music, we can actually immerse them more in this wedding day and hopefully take them back into these scenes that we're showing them. So those music choices that we make and the sound that we're capturing throughout the day, the way that we create our soundscape, it's all about just immersing the viewer into this individual wedding and really celebrating the unique qualities of this day. And that's going to apply in the edit as well. You've got to think about the pacing, the style that you want to do it. For me, I like to use very short clips because I don't actually want to replace a couple's memories. I just want to stimulate them. I want to take them back to that moment and let them remember it and let their minds fill in the blanks. But ultimately, whatever your style, whether it's documentary like me or something highly cinematic or anything in between, there are no rules on this. It's just about creating the type of film that you would want to see, that inspires you, that you enjoy shooting and that you can connect with. Because if you connect with it, then your couples will too. All you really need to create an interesting film is a camera, a lens and a perspective. Now, I hope you found that tutorial helpful. Thanks once again to Fujifilm and the Photography and Video Show for inviting me along. And if you have any specific questions for me, then feel free to contact me on @YorkPlaceStudios on Instagram. Thanks a lot.